I was hoping you wouldn't mention how long I've been doing this because, just by appearance, people probably could tell that I'm actually not as young as I appear, but now the cat's out of the bag. Yeah, I've been doing this a long time. And before we jump in, I do want to say, as an American visiting Canada, let me apologize from the bottom of my heart. To all Canadians, Europeans, Africans, and Asians, I'm not sure if I missed everyone, but you all deserve an apology from the United States. Let me talk, as Walter said, I've been doing surveys for a long time, and there's some things that have been true over the last 30 plus years that I've been doing surveys, and a lot of things that have changed quite a bit. In terms of what's one of the big constants is over the years, employee surveys really have been viewed as somewhat intrusive into the employee's life. If you go back even 20 years ago, a long survey was, say, 125 items, 130 items. Today, if you did a survey of 40 or 50 items, people start saying, it's too long. But regardless of the length of the survey, people continually say, this is not a good time, or this is intrusive. How do we shorten it? How do we make it less of a time commitment for the employee to execute on the survey? But one of the also true things about surveys is they can give insight to solving business problems, right? Insight that may not be obtainable any other way, right? So in this cartoon, you mean all those part-time, temporary, no-benefit employees quit, or is that old-fashioned company loyalty? Well, surveys can answer those kind of questions, and they can do it actually quite well. We did a study. We did a study in preparation for a book chapter that's coming out on surveys. It should be out in 2019. It's part of the ICAP Professional Practice Series. And we asked companies that are undertaking employee surveys. That's why in the middle you can see that 100% employee opinion. So the end size on this is about 43 companies responded. And we asked them about life cycle surveys that they execute on. And this particular slide is in chronological order. So how many companies are doing pre-hire surveys? Well, 33% out of the 43 responded that they did that. Accept decline, 30%. Onboarding new hire, 77%. Let me define a couple of those. So the pre-hire survey, right, is before you hire someone, what are the attitudes and opinions of job applicants? And I can remember for one financial services company, we actually went onto campuses where they were trying to recruit very high potential sort of financial MBAs coming out of the top schools, and they wanted to know what is the perception of these students towards working for our particular company. So they were interested in what are the attitudes of potential applicants to the organization, and how do we persuade them that in fact we are an organization they should apply to. So that's the pre-hire survey. Accept decline, you can obviously get a lot of insights when you examine people who accept your job offer versus people who decline the job offer. And then of course you have the new hire survey, which can get into things like transactions. When you showed up on the job the first day of work, did people know you were coming? Did you have computer equipment waiting for you? Did you have an email address waiting for you? I remember one company I started working for way back when. My first day of work, I got a delivery at my office, and it was the new computer, except I didn't have any login credentials, so it's sitting there on my desk like a brick. And then I got a phone call from the IT guy, and he says, "We sent you your email credentials to your email account." I said, "That's great, but doesn't someone need to tell me how to sign on to my email account?" So, how well is the organization onboarding these new people are things that can be covered in a new hire survey. You also have assimilation surveys. Usually these are done about 90 days into the job. How are you making out? Do you know where to go to solve issues and so forth? Employee opinion surveys, of course, the most common ongoing. Exit surveys then as people leave, and then attrition and boomerang. An interesting way to look at this same data, though, is this way, which is not by chronological order, but by the most commonly used versus least commonly used. So the employee opinion survey, because these are companies doing employee opinion surveys, 100%. But then when you look at the other ones, in terms of surveys being done out there, and these 43%, by the way, are basically Fortune 100 kinds of companies. So the second most common survey are the exit surveys. About 93% of them are also doing that. Onboarding 77, all the way down to helping people prepare for retirement is the least common survey that's being done out there. So this gives you a sense of where organizations are putting their effort. You know, certainly you can do all of these things if you want to, but I really don't know of any organization out there who has the resources or capacity to handle all of this. But it is becoming more and more prevalent, and the notion of life cycle surveys is becoming much more, as Walter's word, ubiquitous. And the reason it's becoming ubiquitous is because for the first time really now, all of these bits and pieces, the employee survey, the exit survey, assimilation, pre-hire survey, and so forth, systems now exist where you can actually tie all of these together into sort of in a big data fashion and be able to look across the employee life cycle. What can we learn from the experiences as we track people through the organization? So for instance, one way that we're doing exit surveys is not simply to ask people once they give notice, you know, what was driving you out of the organization, but rather to treat the exit survey almost as a supplement to the regular employee survey. And so we get a trigger when we find out someone's given notice to leave, we collect the exit data on them, but then we begin to look back to the regular employee survey that was done 6 months earlier and say, let's not look at the rationale or the reasons why people say they're leaving. Let's look at 6 month predictors where we can say, what could we have known about, or what pattern could we have seen 6 months ago that would have given some insight to that this person is at risk to leaving the organization. And by stringing all of these data points together that way, you begin to get not a bunch of different silos of data, but you get to get a continuous stream of data that can be analyzed and given additional insight to the organization. With that capacity and that new ability, though, comes a whole bunch of problems or potential problems that are out there now. There's violations for privacy issues, right? So if you're now tracking people through the organization and their entire life cycle, it's not an anonymous survey, obviously, because you've got to tie them together each step of the way, but it's rather a survey where you really need to know who's who in all of the data. In one reaction to this, not specifically due to this, but just because of larger privacy concerns, Europe, of course, enacted, the EU enacted the General Data Protection Regulations, which took effect May 25th of this year. California right now is also looking at similar kind of legislation to the EU, and I'm assuming that if California goes, the rest of the states eventually are going to follow as well. So there's a lot of concerns about privacy and how's that handled as you begin to look at tracking employees over their life cycle. There's issues about uninformed consent. This is an example of this would be what Cambridge Analytica did in their attempt to collect data to influence the last presidential election in the United States. They got people to give consent to fill out a particular survey, in this case a personality assessment, but then the other people associated with that person, their data was being utilized without them even knowing that the data was being utilized. So that's, I'm calling that uninformed consent. There's of course unobtrusive measures out there now where people are, or data exists, software exists, where you can look at people's digital footprints without them ever knowing that they're being looked at. And in fact, you can, the cameras can be taken over on computers, and you can look at, there's software out there today even where you can look at people's facial expressions. And companies are trying to surmise by facial expression whether this one is someone who's engaged in their job. Talk about an invasion of privacy, right? By the way, as a company, we started giving out little camera covers now for people, so that if you want to cover up your camera so no one can look at you. I've got a few in my bag if you want one. So even beyond though collecting data, what we're now beginning to see in the survey is the idea that these surveys can be used to influence behavior, to influence thoughts and patterns. So the question as psychologists, right, where do you draw the line? You know, we were researching data, we were presenting data to companies. They were using that to try and improve company performance. But now we're beginning to see some places where they're actually shifting towards how do we change people through the survey itself? How do we change their behaviors? How do we change, how do we nudge them to do certain things in a certain way? Things like micro-targeted ads and notifications, nudging are all signs that this is going on. And of course, these things also can lead to addictive behavior on this part. There's also bad actors out there, plain and simple, people who should not be trusted with having access or collecting this kind of data. So there's a lot of concerns out there. And one of the ways you can say what's the impact of these concerns. Now this is out of the world of economic surveys. But if you look at economic surveys, the chart shows surveys that are done in the UK, the US, and Canada. The difference in the average response rate to these economic surveys from 2001 to 2017, you can see a general decline. Where the labor force survey that's done in the UK, and these are surveys that are done to say how do we allocate resources, where do we put funding, where do we put personnel in terms of job training and other kinds of factors, economic-based factors. But you can see in the UK, the average response rate was at 70%, it's now down at 43%. In the US, a similar kind of survey has dropped to 85%, it was at 94%. And in Canada, a similar survey has dropped from 81 to 66%. So there's been a general decline in people's willingness to complete various kinds of surveys. And one of the reasons for this is, you know, the previous slide, the lack of, or concerns about privacy is one, lack of trust is going up. And honestly, there's also just so many more surveys going on. If you compare the amount of surveys that people get exposed to from 1978 to 2003, which is the most recent data I could find, there's been about a fourfold factor increase in terms of the number of surveys people are being asked to complete. So now as you sit at home and your phone rings and someone says, would you mind taking a survey, and you feel like, my God, these are coming at me all the time right now. You're actually accurate. They're coming at you all the time right now. Luckily, though, this kind of decline in response rate, we have not seen yet hit the employee survey side. So this is an example. A, B, C, D, E, F are 6 different clients that we happen to have. A is one that we've had for a long time. But you can see that the response rates that we are hitting on the employee side, one, have been fairly strong still, and they're pretty consistent. Right, so line A is a tech company, line B, which is the lower response rates, a manufacturer. So, you know, the response rates are explainable by the type of population within each of these. But what you do see is that, one, the response rates are still pretty decent, and 2, they're pretty consistent. The question is the illnesses sort of that are afflicting these more general economic surveys that are going on, is that going to start bleeding over into the employee side? And I would say the risk is there unless we double our efforts to make sure that people feel comfortable about responding to these kind of surveys, and in fact that the data will be used appropriately. And just one point I want to make here is, you know, we're talking about employee surveys, but the employees that we survey are not typical in terms of people in the world of work. And given the nature of this conference, I want to take a step back and say, of the more than 3 billion workers out there, when we do surveys, we're surveying just the really the high-end people who are doing well, really solid jobs. But in 2008, 39% of the world workforce was earning less than $2 a day. 21% of those workers earned less than $1.25. 12.3 million of them are victims of forced labor at any given time. 2.5 million of them are trafficked, and fully 98% of all the females are trafficked for commercial sexual exploitation. These are not the people who we are typically surveying. So the people that we're surveying is a very selective group. And just as a nod to Walter, in terms of how long I've been doing this, just some background. The first employee surveys I did, the trend was in Roman numerals. Location codes included things like the Ottoman Empire, and we did a cuneiform translation, and so on and so forth. But we've been doing these kind of surveys for a long time. But more seriously, where did all of these surveys really start? Well, these employee surveys really go back to the 1920s, and they were done mostly in industrial companies, right? There was a big uptick in sort of the notion of employee surveys, and during World War II, where about 500,000 soldiers were surveyed, and they were surveyed on topics ranging from the quality of the food to the quality of the leadership. And in fact, the goal of these World War II surveys was to find units that were high-performing units, try to find the underlying characteristics of these high-performing units, and say, how can we duplicate those characteristics elsewhere? Which is a very common goal even for surveys today, even though the technology has changed and so forth. The idea of saying, what are the high-performing units and how do we make more like that is still a very, very common theme of why these surveys are done. If we look at the trends in the surveys in different time periods of when I've been doing them, if you think back to the 1980s and 90s, these surveys done at that time, they were run by either master's level or PhD consultants. That was the survey lead. Surveys at the time had titles like effectiveness survey or attitude survey, communication survey, HRIS data that we were receiving in terms of which people were in which occupation and other things about them like tenure, gender, et cetera, was very, very shaky. At the time then, surveys were largely anonymous and confidential, meaning we didn't know who you were, and neither did the company when you responded to a survey. Typical survey at that time was 125 items, had 3 or 4 write-ins, and about 4 demos. Paper at the time was always a component of these earlier surveys. Interactive voice response was almost always done. Translations were viewed as going above and beyond. Comments were typed in, hand-edited, and reviewed. There was almost always focus groups done ahead of the survey to figure out what were the right items to ask. Manager training was done in person, often in a 4 to 8 hour session, often with role-playing. So manager training during this time period was very, very extensive. I remember taking one senior management team of a company to Montego Bay for the weekend to teach them how to read their survey results. Somebody had to do it, so I volunteered. CEO meetings at that time would last 2 to 3 hours, and the typical CEO presentation was 120 pages. Getting reports out to managers took a month, right? And training the trainer to say, how do you go out and consult with others in the organization would be about a 2-day workshop. So this was in the 80s, right? Then if we move on to the 2000s, all of a sudden in the 2000s, in terms of employee surveys, what we started to see are some tools like Zoomerang and SurveyMonkey came onto the market. And people started trying to do these surveys themselves in-house. At this time, what you began to see, in order to reduce costs in consulting companies, survey projects were no longer run by consultants, but they were run by project managers. Project managers may have a bachelor's or a master's in anything, communications or management or whatever, sometimes in IO in terms of running these survey projects. And all of a sudden, employee surveys became engagement surveys. The questions were the same, but instead of calling them satisfaction surveys, they were called engagement surveys or pulse surveys. One of the big things that helped quite a bit is HRIS data became accurate. So you didn't have to load up the data and then spend a couple of months correcting it all before the survey went live. Surveys now, at this window, went down to about 40 to 60 items. Paper has gone away at this stage. IPR is fading. Translations would become more standard. Comments now became self-coded as opposed to hand-coded here. Usually focus groups went away. So we no longer did focus groups to determine the content of the survey. Rather, we just did a couple of executive interviews to say what should the survey cover for your particular organization. But reporting still took 4 weeks. And then finally, where are we now in terms of where these surveys are going? Engagement surveys are still very common, but people are now beginning to ask what comes after employee engagement. What's the next iteration of where this should go? And one of the things that's becoming much more prevalent is the notion of strategic surveys. The idea of a strategic survey is really asking people if the organization has a particular strategy, and the strategy is often not how to be like everybody else, but the strategy is what is unique to this particular organization, what's going to differentiate them. What the survey tends to be about these days is what are aspects of the strategy, or what are aspects of the employment environment that's enabling the strategy to be implemented, and what's getting in the way. Now, employee engagement may be part of that, right? If people are not really engaged in their work, that can impact the strategy. But these strategic surveys tend to be much more far-ranging than the older engagement surveys that were done. Technology is becoming a larger and larger and larger part of the offering. The most common occupation in the company now has gone from consultants and project managers is now IT people. So the technology just keeps growing, and it's like an all-consuming kind of animal in terms of resources in companies. What is also happening today is the industry itself is changing pretty dramatically. There has been a rapid consolidation where a lot of the smaller players are being bought up by large consulting houses. And secondly, there's a lot of venture capital flooding into the employee survey industry right now. I get calls from venture capitalists probably once a month offering to invest in the organization. And typically they would say, what are you doing that you can call AI? And if you can call it artificial intelligence, we're going to fund you. If you can't call it artificial intelligence, we're not interested. There's an awful lot of companies out there who are claiming to do artificial intelligence that are not, but we do see the beginnings of sort of seeds of actual artificial intelligence being done. And I think that's going to continue to grow in the next decade or so, and probably by the end of the next decade, you will see true artificial intelligence in the survey space. So let me stop there and turn it over to the next.
Thanks everyone for coming today. What I have is really a follow-on to Jeff's topic here. So Jeff brought up some really good points about where our market is headed as far as how employee surveys are changing, how technological advances are influencing the way our organizations are asking us to look at data, and the inherent dangers in some of that. So that leaves a lot of practitioners in a place where we have to move forward with the trends, but we really want to make sure we're doing so in an ethical way that's really driven by science rather than being led by the technology. So my goal today is really to step back and look at, how can we interpret some of these market trends and take the best parts of them to build and drive good effectiveness programs while doing so with the best conceptual underpinnings. So I don't have a lot of data or p-values for you today. Hopefully that's okay on a nice Saturday afternoon at the end of the conference. More of an overall look at the market. And I'm going to start by illustrating some of these situations and how they come up with our clients and how we end up in these conversations about what's most important. So this first one is a recent example where an organization came to us asking for something that's called continuous listening, or wanting to survey their employees really around the year to have an ongoing pulse of how things are going rather than a once-a-year event. So they said, okay, here we are, we have this survey, but we need to shift from an annual one-time event to a quarterly pulse. And as usual, we say, oh, that sounds great. We're here to do a good survey, let's do it. But tell us a little bit about why. We want to understand the background behind this so we can build something that's effective. Well, last time we did an annual survey, our top leaders didn't pay attention. Why is this our solution, is our question. So in this aspect, the goal of the survey is to drive action, and if a one-time survey didn't drive action, why are we trying to do more surveys? What is going to happen if we ask employees their opinions more often? There's a little bit of a disconnect there. Here, it feels like the ask from the client is really driven by the technology and what other companies are doing, not a strategic ask or need within the organization. One more example that comes up often, we have another client that says, okay, we have to shift to on-demand surveys. Rather than having a scheduled survey, they need to come up as different events happen in the organization, and we say we can do that. Let's hear a little bit about why. Well, those millennials, they need data all the time. They need things to happen faster. They're just that way. And I especially go, sure, those horrible millennials, especially in America, there are a lot of sort of pop research articles about how millennials are so different than everyone else, how they have all of these completely different needs because they grew up with technology. And there are certainly differences across generations, just as there are individual differences across any group of people, but of all the things to spin your HR strategy around or to spin your employee listening programs around, it's just not it. Millennials, just like any other group of employees, want to feel heard, want to see their feedback move forward, but it's not a reason to change the overall cadence or design of your survey program. First, let's get it right with acting on the annual survey. That's to be our message. So, these are two different examples about why companies sometimes come to us wanting to change the mechanics of their survey. Certainly changing mechanics with technology can be a great thing to do, but these are illustrations of doing it for the wrong reasons, doing it because the executive thinks it's a good thing to do, because someone down the street thinks it's a good thing to do, not because it's in line with the strategy of your organization and what you need to drive meaningful change. So I want to step back and look at some of the other trends that we see there in the market that are coming up. The first I just talked about, continuous listening and always-on data collection. This is really moving from that annual survey to something more frequent. Often the idea here is, we take in other kinds of data more frequently, so why shouldn't we take in employee survey data more frequently? Others are related to technology and how we look at the data. So, when we had a longer survey that was done on different means and we had longer time frames, we could certainly do a lot of these analyses in a more manual way and really take our time in crafting the story to bring it back to the organization on what they should do. Now that we're using deep learning and natural language processing for other kinds of data in our organizations, our executives look to us and say, well, why don't we do this with the employee data? Why can't we move things faster and have different kinds of insights if we use these methods? And certainly they do offer other kinds of opportunity than our traditional analyses. And then finally, there's different approaches. So looking at things like organizational network analysis that isn't about an employee's opinion, but really how different parts of the organization relate to each other and get things done. How do ideas flow within the organization? Who talks to who, and how does that impact how things get done? Another is social media scraping or wearables. These are really passive data collection systems. So if we're looking for that always-on data, often organizations say, well, we want the data all the time, but we don't want to ask our employees, can't we just scrape it from data we already have and pull together some insights that predict who's going to leave? Certainly that's possible in some ways, but we need to look at it a lot differently than our traditional employee surveys. So, all of these together are things sort of woven in the pot of what organizations are hearing about in the marketplace and want to infuse in different ways in their survey programs. And so we see this piece at the bottom that the traditional employee survey is dead. We need to incorporate these different ways of surveying more frequently, looking at different ways of analyzing the data and bringing in some of that passive data to ultimately get more insight from our surveys. And we certainly do want more insight, but we also want to step back and say, how are we getting it? And is this the kind of insight we need to drive meaningful change? And if we look at the kind of trends we're talking about here, they really fall in a specific bucket of survey mechanics. So we're looking at how do we collect the data, how do we measure the data, and how are we sharing results? A lot of these are very tech-driven, and they're all very much about the survey mechanics rather than the content of the survey, or even more importantly, the follow-up. What happens after the survey? What happens when you get this data back? That's not what these trends are about. They're really, part of this green circle on the model here about insight. So the model up on the page here is our, organizational effectiveness model. We use this to drive all the programs that we offer our clients, where we want to start with strategy. What's most important to an organization? How can we collect data that will help inform purpose, help inform the kinds of decisions leaders need to make? And ultimately, we want it to drive the meaningful change. A survey for a survey's sake isn't useful to anyone. We're doing this to get leaders the data they need to move forward. So, in a way, the blue and the orange bubble up here are the most important ones. These are our goals. These are, what make it worthwhile. So if we're spending all of our time in this green bubble about mechanics, that can be a bit of a lost effort. So our advice to survey practitioners is the insight's important. The mechanics of how we get it done are important, but they should be informed by the strategy and be driving towards action rather than starting with the insight saying, what's the coolest technology and how do we build around that? And that leaves some survey professionals like us and likely some of you in a bit of a tough situation. So there are these exciting market trends, and there are leaders asking, how do we keep up with the market? How do we have the best program out there? Yet we all want to make sure we're coming from a really scientific and rigorous place. So the next few slides I have are a couple of guidelines that we use in order to interpret the trends and make sure that we are moving forward and doing innovative things with our surveys, but doing so in an ethical and science-driven way. The first piece we have here is to be strategic is to be unique. So when we're writing a survey, we say if you hold it up, it should feel like your organization. It should be about the kind of issues that are most important for your success, and it should sound like the way your employees talk. If you hold it up, it shouldn't feel like it could be used at any other organization down the street. So the more your approach is strategic, it has to be unique to your company. And so the implication here, when you're looking at different directions in the market, is that an off-the-shelf approach isn't going to be strategic. If it's off the shelf and it works for another organization down the street, it's not going to be specific enough to get you the kind of data you need for your leaders to make decisions. So there's often that blend in the market of do I go with something that's well used by many organizations, or do I build something myself? And our advice here is to be as strategic and unique as you can. The second piece here is about the use of AI and different kinds of machine learning technology. And so we want to be really clear that this is the direction our field is headed, and we want to use AI to help us do more and scale, but we have to do it in a smart way. So, machines don't replicate people, but they do some things a whole lot better. So, as an example, a lot of machine learning programs are used in recruiting and selection. And if we use certain machine learning programs and we feed it the same data we've always looked at, the machine is going to replicate the decisions it's always made in the past. So if we feed it some biased data, it's going to give us a biased output just faster. And that doesn't help anyone. So as an example, there's a study where a machine learning tool was set to identify candidates for a sales leadership role, and it was choosing candidates that were high school quarterbacks at a really, really high rate. And we can all look at that and say, are people who are a quarterback in high school, played this sport, are they any better at sales leadership? Certainly not. There might be some kind of third variable there around goal orientation or the kinds of education they were involved in, but ultimately, what the machine did is it replicated a picture of past success, that people who had this specific educational upbringing were white men of a certain generation were going to be who was most successful in that role. And so in a way, the machine did its job. It replicated past success, but in doing so, it excluded women, it excluded anyone who didn't play this sport. It simply replicated a bad decision. So if we feed biased data into these machines, it's not going to do anything better for us. So we need to step back and look at how can we use AI to help us identify relationships we don't know to look for. How can we use it to scale the kinds of analyses that we can't do as quickly, and essentially spread our reach rather than just doing what we do faster. And that brings us to the next piece of integrating data and change initiatives. So most clients we work with have a lot of questions of their data, and they have a lot of data, but the challenge is in bringing it together. So Jeff talked a lot about life cycle surveys and how we can start to be predictive if we link the different kinds of surveys together rather than simply looking at them on their own. So instead of asking additional surveys, the goal here is to get more insight by linking what you have together. So if you do a regular survey throughout the year and you do an exit survey, we can take people who exited the organization and see how did they look 6 months ago, and how was that different than the rest of the employees in the organization? What could have predicted them getting frustrated and leaving, and how can we then take those findings and intervene on other people who might be at risk to prevent them from having the same frustrations? That's one way where we can get a whole lot more insight of bringing the two surveys together without going out and finding more data. So some of the advice here is, before complicating any mechanics or collecting more data, consider whether the answers are found in combinations that already exist, or simply a different look at the data. And related, there's a saying that what gets measured gets done, and that then there's an assumption that if we ask employees their opinions more often, we're going to act more. That was the very first example of the client coming to us and saying, we got to ask more surveys so that we can drive change forward. And that can often be really overwhelming for an organization. More data doesn't necessarily lead to more action. It can also lead to analysis paralysis and how do I move forward with all of this? So, our goal here is to design programs not to get as much data as possible, but to get data that's compelling for action and fits in with the change initiatives leaders are already working on. If we have leaders that are driving towards customer-focused kinds of goals, if we can gather data that will show them how employees feel they're meeting their goals, I bet they're going to take a look. So we want to design not just for when in the calendar year can we ask, but when is that data most important to those leaders? And then related, we want to tell the story. So we gather a lot of data. There are certainly sophisticated things we can do and a whole lot of p-values we can show our leaders, but we know that doesn't ultimately drive a lot of action. We want to tell connections that help them see how the employee experience relates to the effectiveness of their organization. What employee opinions can predict operational metrics or customer success, and how can they take those pieces of data and work on improving those areas that are going to have not just an effect on the employee experience, but on the success of their business. So, based on those 5 guidelines, I want to come back to another example with a client and say, what would this look like in practice? So here we've got yet another client saying, we need to survey more often. We need quarterly pulses across these business units. And as usual, great, let's do it, but why are we doing this? And this client says they have a really unique product development cycle, and so we need to see what these employees need at different parts of the cycle. And we want to jump in and get started with this right away. And how's this different than the initial ones? It's the same ask for a more frequent survey, but it's not driven by the technology. It's driven by a business need to understand the reality of these employees at critical parts of a product development cycle so that we can better support them and be more effective as an organization. So, all of these bring together, some comparisons about what were surveys like, what are they like now, and how are they moving forward. Have an example here of how, look at a deliverable in different points of time really changes it. These are two very different paintings in different styles that in their own time were the highest selling painting. And on the left, this Renoir was $78 million, and it's beautiful. And on the right, Jackson Pollock, $200 million. And so the point here is they're not really comparable. In their own time, they were the leading painting and the gold standard, but simply looking back and comparing them, they're coming from different contexts, and so we have to judge them in their own time. And so some of our advice is let's judge our survey programs and what creates success in our own time and in our own organizational context. So, what do we know to be true? This change is going to continue, and I think it's going to continue at a faster and faster pace. We're going to continue to see the technology change, and as the technology changes, our survey programs are going to change, they're going to become faster, and we're going to continue to see the pop media tell us how we need to survey and why the technology should lead the way. And our role as survey practitioners is to judge those choices intelligently and find in which ways can technology help us do better and serve our organizations better, and where do they not hold up to science? How can we inject our own perspective to guide where the technology is going? And our goal is to do that within this three-part framework. So, again, each of these parts are really important, but we want to start with the strategy of what is the purpose of the organization, how are we collecting data to support that in a way that supports organizational change and improvement, and then build those insight kinds of mechanics around it, rather than the other way around. So with that, I'll leave you with this model. That's our ultimate way to interpret these market trends and come up with a modern but scientific-driven survey. Thank you.
So thanks everyone. Hope you're having a good afternoon. As Walter said, my name is Penny Kuma-Welch. I'm a People Analytics Manager at GSK. And my goal here is just to give you a flavor of how surveys, employee surveys in particular, have changed over the years at GSK for many of the same reasons that Jeff and Victoria just spoke about. So a little bit about GSK for anyone who's not familiar. We are a science-led global healthcare company whose purpose is very, very specific and very well known, at least for GSK employees. It's to help people do more, feel better, and live longer. So in every survey that we ever done, when we ask people, what keeps you engaged with your work, what makes you want to stay at Glaxo, it's really this underlying mission, that the things that we're trying to do for people in the world are really very noble and worthwhile. So we have about 100,000 employees in around 116 countries worldwide. We are based in Brentford, in London, in the UK. And we, everything that we do is supposed to be underpinned by these 4 values that you see here, which is to be patient-focused, to act with integrity, to show respect for people, and to operate with full transparency. So that's our goal. Healthcare and pharma companies in the last few years in particular have gotten a bad rap, especially in terms of being transparent about things and showing that we really care about people, not just produce products in order to make a profit. And so this is something that's really driven and really underlies everything that happens at Glaxo. So a little bit more about us. We have 3 global business units. So we are end-to-end providers of pharmaceuticals, of vaccines, and of consumer healthcare products. And when I say end-to-end, we do all of the research and development up front. We do all of the manufacturing of those products, and then we do all of the supply and commercialization of those products. So we have 89 manufacturing sites and serving over 190 countries. And just here in the little boxes are just a couple of our products. So depending on kind of which space you're in, you may recognize some of them. So we do have some fairly large products and presences in each of these categories. And so with that means that we have a very diverse range of the types of employees that we survey, from executives and very senior people to scientists, R&D scientists, to medical doctors and health professionals, down to production workers who are on site in sometimes very, very small markets where it's traditionally been difficult to survey them. So in order to kind of understand where we are now and why that transition has been important for us, it stands to reason that we should start at kind of the beginning of where we were and then show you how we've progressed. So the history of GSK can really be traced to something like 1873 in New Zealand, but really the employee survey story begins in about the year 2000, which is when when Glaxo Wellcome merged with SmithKline Beecham to become GlaxoSmithKline. And at that time, the reason that we did an employee survey was really just to make sure that we could integrate these two very different cultures into one larger company. And so we wanted to understand a bit more about how are these cultures different, can we make them into one cohesive unit. So this survey was what we consider a traditional employee survey. It was focused on a number of different topics, all very broad, everywhere from quality of leadership to management to the different values that we wanted to address, to engagement, empowerment. But the thing is, it was limited only to senior leaders. So there were certain upper grade bands, and those were the only opinions that we gathered for these data, these surveys. We also only did it every 2 years because at that time, it took a really long time to roll out a survey worldwide. And so it took just enough time for us to collect all of that data and to synthesize all of the results and to present those results back to leadership. And for them to actually take action on it, then it would be kind of like a 2-year cycle where that really made sense. So starting in 2009, so 2008, we had a new CEO come on board, and he was really very adamant that it's not right that we only survey the top leadership, right? So we should be going out to every employee. So our survey transitioned to become a census survey. We dropped our focus down a little bit, so we still asked about a very broad set of topics, but we were really focused on empowerment and engagement in particular for those employees. We still only did it every 2 years, so it was still biennial, but it did allow us to gather feedback from obviously a lot more people in the company. Our senior leaders, however, were the only ones who received results. So our C-suite of executive team members and maybe a level or two down, they were the only ones who received the feedback from those surveys. Starting in 2015, we started to get a little bit more with the times. People could take their survey on mobile devices. The number of paper surveys that we did, which we had been doing in the past, had gone down to virtually none. And then we started to do a bit more of actually carrying over survey items. So that was the other thing, that with every 2-year cycle, it just turned out that the things that they were interested in 2 years later were not always the same things that they were interested in before. So we would have to create a whole new set of items. You wouldn't have the trend data that's there. You wouldn't be able to see historically how we've progressed. So in 2015, we got a little bit better and we carried over a full half of our survey items. So now that we can see some actual progress on those items. We also shifted the focus to almost exclusively engagement and those drivers, those things that we thought would improve engagement. And this time, we also made a shift in that all people managers, so managers who had teams of a certain size, were now eligible to receive their own reports. So this was a shift for us because in the past, of course, it had been only senior leadership who received results, and now we're talking about every leader who has at least 5 people in their team. We're now able to get results and potentially look at how they're progressing on things. In 2016, we had gotten a notion that this idea of continuous listening was starting to be a thing. How do we survey more frequently? We thought the way that we would kind of try to implement that at GSK was to do some pulse surveys, where these pulse surveys were in the off year of our every 2-year cycle. We would allow business units and functions to customize some of their items, to ask things specific to the HR function, for example, or specific to the pharma business, for example. We found out that this was a very, very difficult thing to do and sustain, and it didn't work out quite as well as we thought it might. It was very complex. The analysis of those results was very complex. And so that was the first and last time that we did pulse surveys. And in this time, we were also undergoing a vendor search because, like many other companies at the time, we were being asked to come up with to present our surveys in a way that was more modern, more new, more fresh. So in 2017, we had our new CEO come on board, Emma Walmsley, our first female CEO, and she came in to that role with some very, very clear ideas of here's what the strategy of GSK should be. She was an internal move, so she had been previously the president of our consumer healthcare business. So she had seen the GSK survey over the years and known how it had been used and what kind of items were in there. So when she came on board as CEO, she had some very, very specific ideas about this needs to be a strategic survey. We don't need to be focusing on these other things quite as much, at least not in this particular venue. And what we're going to do is we're going to run this more frequently so that we can get more data at specific points in time and that we can track progress over time so the items are not going to change. So that's what we've been doing. She came in March, or maybe it was April 1st of 2017. We ran our first survey in September of 2017. We ran our second wave this past March, and we are now gearing up to run our third wave here in September of 2018. So we've carried over 95% of the items. The real things that have changed have been the open-ended question, that we try to dig a little bit deeper into what's behind some of the closed-ended items. But for the most part, the survey is exactly the same as it was when we did it last September. So the shift that we had to deal with was, again, we had been so used to asking what would be considered a traditional employee survey set of questions. You know, how effective is your manager? How confident are you in GSK's ability to compete? What do you, are you proud to work here? Those kinds of things. And shifting that to fit with what Emma really wanted this survey to do and feel for her. So the request from her was make it new, make it fresh, make it modern, interpret that how you will. There's lots of ways that we could go with that, so we just kind of picked a couple of things and hoped that we were hitting the right mark. Make the survey more frequent, maybe not to the extent of continuous listening. We're not asking a question every day, but make it more continuous than we had been in the past. Make it more tightly focused, make it more strategic. Don't branch out into 10, 12, 15 different topic areas in this one survey. We need to be very tight. And then we're only going to provide results to leaders who we feel can materially impact the culture. So this was a little bit of a step in the other direction that we had gone. So we had before given leaders, senior leaders, results. We had moved to giving every manager of people results. And now we're moving back to, there's a select set of leaders that we really think can impact the strategy and the way that that strategy is implemented in GSK. And those are the people that are going to get results. Now, we did expect that there would be a backlash from leaders who are used to receiving something from the survey. And so now you're telling them, we don't have results for you. But we had gone out with the idea that those other items that we traditionally asked you, those are not going away. They're just not going to be part of this particular survey. So we're going to roll out a new suite of assessments that you as a leader can opt into participating in. There's a 360 feedback process that you can opt into. There is a upward feedback that you as a manager can get from your team. There is a high-performing teams assessment that you can put your team through to kind of get facilitated support and how to make your team the best that it can be. So we did come out with this kind of, don't worry, you're still going to be able to get these kinds of things. It's just not going to be the mechanism that you are used to getting them. And then we wanted, Emma was really clear about wanting managers and leaders themselves, those who are getting results, to take action and accountability for the results. So rather than relying on human resources to deliver your results to you, to sit down with you, to walk you through each of those results, she wanted to put the onus on the leaders themselves, to say, this is your data, you know what we're trying to achieve, we can help you get there, but the first step is that you have to take accountability for it. You have to take the report, look at it, figure out where you want to start, and then let's have a conversation about how to do that. And that is something that our leaders had not traditionally been asked to do. They'd been basically just fed data and said, here's your report, here's what we think you should do about this, now go forth and do it. So this was a slightly different kind of take on what it meant for them. So the result was that I think that we achieved most of what she asked for, although with every iteration of the survey, we're learning a little bit more, finessing kind of her ask. So we did come up with a new vendor, so we hired Work Vitality. We now have a survey that feels very, very different than what we did in the past, both in terms of how it looks and how it feels and operates. Anyone with an internet connection anywhere can fill out the survey from any kind of mobile device, which is much more modern than kind of we're used to. We went from a biennial survey every 2 years to biannual, so now we do it every 6 months, which is a big change for the organization. And our items now, of course, are now focused on our strategic priorities. They were custom written to address, here are our 3 strategic priorities, and here are the things that we think will get us there. So most of those conventional employee engagement or employee survey items were moved to these other tools that I mentioned. Roughly 700 or so leaders did receive results. They were considered our culture influencers, and so and being told that they were a culture influencer, I think, did a lot to kind of get them excited about going in and doing this kind of self-service action that we were asking them to do, which is go into this new portal that we've created for you. Examine your results, dig a little bit deeper, go in and take a look at what you think is happening, come up with a story, and then we'll help you understand how to move that forward. So our reception so far, so we've done, again, 2 waves, 31 languages. Our last survey had 86,000 respondents. We deployed in 112 countries, an employee engagement of 79%, which is very good for us and is not changing for us. So our employee engagement is remaining steady. And then we had 900 plus reports distributed to global leaders. So not only those leaders that were scheduled to get one, but we would have a general manager in a particular country that he needs to see, all of the businesses and functions that operate in his country, kind of how are they all feeling about certain aspects of culture. Our response rate has traditionally been very good, I think, for surveys in general, but we did see the highest ever response rate that we've ever gotten for this survey at 84%. So we're continuing to monitor that. Hopefully it won't go down, but with it going out every 6 months, we just weren't sure what to expect as far as the survey responses, maintaining that high level. And then here is a screenshot of the portal that we make available for our leaders to go in and kind of do a little bit of just looking around at their results. They're able to compare different groups within their businesses and teams. They're able to look at the results of their direct reports compared against each other, just to see if those are different functions and how they're answering differently to some of those items. So at the 2-week mark after we released the results to these leaders, we did have 76% of those leaders actually access the portal, 55% of them actually downloading the report. So for us, that was a good indicator of something's happening. We don't know how many of them are actually going in and doing that behavior of looking at the results and really coming up with their story, but the fact that they're actually going in was a positive sign to us. So I think we're just going to keep monitoring that over time to make sure that that's not dropping off and they're not reverting back to relying on HR to come to them and tell them what the story is. So the GSK survey has typically had a very high standing in our company. Everybody knows what it is. Everybody kind of expects it. This is just an example. This is our homepage, our internal homepage. And if you go to our company, you have your typical things about what is it about our company that you want to know. And then there's the option there about the GSK survey. So that goes to show just a little bit of how prominent our survey is. It is the largest data gathering initiative that we have for employee opinions at GSK. There's nothing like it anywhere. And each of the individual business units, the only way that they get that employee feedback is to participate in this survey. So it's got a really very good reputation, and so we're going to utilize that as much as we can to try to move some of these things forward. So what have we learned and found? There are things that we're trying to figure out as we go along. We've never had this much data available at this rapid a pace on these kinds of things all at one time, so we're a little bit of trying to figure out as we go along. We're starting to do some statistical analyses to figure out kind of what is underpinning some of our results. Because they don't include your traditional employee survey items, it's hard to decide if there are underlying constructs that we can really look at. So they're not things like challenging work and motivation and things that you kind of look at, because they're strategy based. So we're starting to do a little bit of work trying to figure out, even with the strategy based items, are there things that kind of underpin some of those that we can really use? Our engagement index, We're still kind of looking at, what that's related to in our particular survey. It's not a traditional drivers of engagement survey the way that we used to have, so we're still trying to suss out how do we use the engagement index kind of going forward. Our engagement hasn't really been changing at all. It's been fairly high and consistent, so kind of what do we take from that and where do we go from there? Our particular survey, it gives employees the option to rate any of these items on a strongly disagree to strongly agree scale, but we also give employees the ability to skip an item altogether or to respond that they don't know or they feel that they are unable to answer the survey. So that sixth option is very different for us. We've never given people the option to say, I just don't know. And the reason why we included it is because with these being a strategic survey and it being rolled out something like 6 odd months after the new CEO came in, there was a really big possibility that the strategy had just not reached a lot of people by that point. They would see an item in the survey, they may not understand what it is that actually means. The strategy hasn't gotten to them yet. So we wanted to know how prevalent that was. By including this don't know option, we could see the progress for if let's say 12% of people didn't understand what this question was asking in September, and now that's moved down to 5% of the people don't understand what that question means when we look in March. That gives us some kind of indication of how well, or we think it does anyway, how well our communication strategy is working. Are those messages being cascaded in the way that we hope and intend them to do? And then we're, as with any survey, we're starting to look a little bit more at trends over time, which when you're on a 2-year cycle maybe doesn't make as much sense because there's so much inflow and outflow of different employees. People are moving around in the organization. It's hard to do an apples to apples comparison. However, with every 6 months, you're able to really track people, where they're going, who's coming into the organization, who's leaving, who's moving into other businesses, and really do a really good comparison over time. So we're getting a little bit better at that, looking at not only how the same people answer different items over time, but how the aggregate of different groups answer those survey items. So these are just a couple of visuals that we've been playing with, trying to figure out some of that underlying stuff. So the things that still worry us, like I said, our survey, every administration, we kind of learn a little bit something new, but there are still things that we're still trying to come to grips with. One is survey fatigue. So we had an 83 response rate in September, an 84 response rate in March. We are under no illusion that that's going to remain that high over time. As we know from survey research, one of the ways that you keep response rates high is that you show evidence that things are happening off the back of those results. And so we just have to continually help people understand the reason that this thing is being implemented is because you said this in the survey. And I think that will help us to maintain that high level of response rate, but it's quite possible that people will become complacent, and by that I mean leaders, kind of taking that for granted, doing things and not always tying it back to the survey. So we're going to definitely keep an eye on that, but we're worried that 2, 3, 4 cycles down the road, we'll slowly start slipping down into the 50 or below kind of response rate as people get tired of seeing this every 6 months. Sustainability, because we're doing it every 6 months, now we've compounded all of that work and effort that many man-hours go into running a survey globally in 32 languages, in all online, and it's a big production for anyone who's done surveys. And so trying to now duplicate that and do that level of work twice per year has been very, very draining. So we're trying to figure out ways to streamline, to make it more effective, to scale up some of our solutions. So that is worrisome, whether or not we can kind of keep up the pace of that. We are still having pushes for supplemental items from businesses that we're going to have to try to fight back off because she wants it very focused and tight. Monitoring and controlling access to results and data is kind of like what Jeff was talking about before with GDPR. Now everybody wants to know, what are you doing with our data? How is it being used? Is it being used for the same thing you said in your consent statement? So we're trying to be very, very clear about those things and walking that line between what is considered good research and good data management versus here are the things that our CEO is asking for. She wants to know how these things are related to retention and turnover, and can we actually do that given the consents in place? We have an over-reliance and a misplaced focus on response rates. So as the survey rolls out, it becomes this race to the finish for everyone to achieve 100% response rate, which is not really a goal that we're trying to do, but it's kind of the nature of the beast. You have Several business units, lots of different countries, they're all trying to be the best. And what that leads to in a lot of ways are these behaviors that we don't want to encourage. We don't want leaders to be coercing their employees to complete a survey that's supposed to be voluntary. But you have these leaders coming back to us saying, I don't think my response rate is right, it should be 100%. I know this because I watched them take it. These are things that we're trying to dissuade people from doing, and trying to get them to understand that once you reach a certain level of response rate, you're not really gaining anything additional as far as what the results of your team are going to say. Transparency of results and delivery expectations. With more and more data, we have more people saying, well, why can't we get results faster? Well, the fact of the matter is that our CEO wants to see the results first. She wants to have a story ready. She wants to know how to approach these. What's that perceived is, how are they spinning this? How is that, what are they trying to hide from us? Those kinds of things. So we're having to try to manage some of those expectations of, we're getting it out very, very quickly, but there are certain things that our leadership kind of want to see in advance. That ties also to more data and unrealistic leader expectations. So as we get more and more data back very quickly, leaders are more inclined to say, well, can you do this special analysis for me so that I can know where my people are, are they leaving the company? What are they doing? All that kind of stuff. And it takes time to get agreements in place to link some of that data together. It's not really clear for leaders that we can't always do those analyses. There's some legal hoops you have to jump through. And so we're having to manage some of those expectations, whereas before we didn't have to deal with it because it was, again, every 2 years. And so people were busy working on just survey results at that point rather than linking all of that data together. And then this desire, this push and pull for strategic alignment. So again, we changed the survey so that it would be about strategy. With now this focus on low scores. So we wanted it to be about how do we move the strategy forward. But what we found over the last 2 administrations is that people are very, very focused on where the lowest scores are, even if those low scores are not about strategy. Sort of things about infrastructure and whether or not I have the systems to do my work. All very important, but it speaks to a different kind of focus of what we had intended. So we're having to deal with that now. Leadership, it was an unintended kind of consequence of that, and leadership is now having to try to deal with that. How do we push strategy forward at the same time addressing low scores in other areas? Yeah, I'm getting pulled off the stage. I'm being called for time. So I'll leave you with just a couple of these things. There's definitely some new things on the horizon. Again, those 3 tools that I talked about before. Trying to move toward more continuous listening on other tools, maybe not the survey itself. And then us trying to tie it all together to try and really get a handle on how leaders can understand all of their data in totality, and then how we as a central group looking at all this data together can really pull it all together in a story for people. And that's it.